Welcome to another episode of Resourceful. My name is Tom Manners, my website tommanners.co.uk, but this isn't about me. This is about you guys who are taking on the challenge of mixed attainment this year. Obviously with the current scenario, some people have maybe had it forced upon them. Some departments have been wanting to do it for ages, and it's an opportunity to take it on. And today I'm very lucky to be joined by two people who have great experience, great passion for it. And in the next 60 minutes, hopefully going to share many great ideas, maybe how it should work as a department, maybe in the classroom, and some of the resources as well. And so I'm really, really pleased to welcome Tom Francome and Helen Hindle. Come on down. Hello.
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 Now, I've met you both in different circumstances, but Helen, I've met you 3 years ago at one of your mixed attainment conferences because you've been creating quite a few of those in the last year. Obviously not so much this year, but it's been something that mixed attainment conferences you've been running for a few years now.
Yeah, and they're usually biannually, so usually January and June. I can't actually remember when the first one was. I don't know if you can remember, Tom, but they've been going for a while now.
2016.
2016, yeah.
And that would be a year after, Tom, that you were head of department of the TES Math Team of the Year here in Birmingham, and it was a mixed attainment setting then, wasn't it?
Yeah, so that was teaching mixed attainment groups for about, 7 or 8 years.
And so I'm hoping today that there will be people a bit nervous about taking it on in the next year. And just like anything else, when it's new to your profession, it can be scary. So I'm hoping today we'll be able to allay some of those fears for people and make people feel a bit more confident and excited by going into it. Because my feeling about it, and I know I'm doing it for the first time as well, properly this year. I've done it a little bit in the past, but I know next year I've got I'm taking it on for year 8 and year 7. I think it is almost the excitement of developing the mathematician within me and with the pupils within the questions. And so I'm having to think more about the mathematical thinking. But let's get started on it. I think I'm going to share my screen because my intention, again, so let's go through this, the aims of the hour, to consider the leadership perspective, introducing mixed attainment maths. Also then to look at it from a perspective of the teacher, and maybe what features of the classroom, what would be the common things that pupils should be doing, what responses you want, what should be the, why is it different, what expectations maybe should there be, and then maybe definitely to discuss the range of resources, because there are a range of resources out there already, which I know you're both very passionate about. Now, we'll come to this website a little bit later on when we look at these resources, because I know, Helen, that you've been uploading more and more in the last couple of weeks, and this is being recorded at the start of July, and I'm sure, as you were just saying to me before we started recording, by the end of July you'll hopefully have got more on there, so good on you for doing that. Let's start with leadership, because you both led your departments,
Yeah.
I believe, as mixed attainment. So what's the first advice you would give to a department who are beginning mixed attainment?
Well, I would say do it slowly and gradually, win hearts and minds, get everyone on board. So like nothing like this really would be the ideal way to do it.
Indeed.
Not rush into it. But I suppose if you're not in that situation, then there are things to think about what the lessons are going to look like, what the planning's going to look like, who's going to do what, how's it going to be different if it is going to be different from what you were doing before. What are the kinds of things that you could be thinking about now that might be helpful for September? I think there's all sorts of things that those might be. I don't know, what would you say, Helen?
Yes, I'd agree with all of that, but I think because it's happening in the circumstances that it is, I think that heads of maths and team leaders are going to have to find the positives in it and really emphasise those with their teams. And I think really importantly is make sure that the children that you're teaching feel that you are teaching them in mixed attainment classes because you believe in it, and really sell that idea to them as well. I think it would be a bit of a disaster if the entire maths team felt negatively about it and that somehow translated itself to the children. So when I've been in schools and we've introduced mixed attainment, we're very open with the children about what we're doing and why. And we talk to them about the fact that we're teaching you in mixed attainment classes because we believe that every single one of you is capable of succeeding in maths and has the ability to be good at maths. and we don't want to label anyone, and we don't want to limit your learning, and we want you all to learn from one another. So I think even though there are obviously going to be heads of department being sort of forced into mixed attainment, I think approach it as positively as you can and re-emphasise the positives continually with the students and parents and any other people that are involved in the process.
I don't think you can emphasise that enough, actually, because there'll be, if the teachers go straight in and say, well, given the current circumstances, you're in a different group, we wouldn't have done that, we'd have done setting, you immediately put one big wall up, haven't you? And I think it's worth repeating that. So you mentioned, though, the key features and the why. So what would you say those key messages are? To some people, these will seem immediately obvious, but you're absolutely right that research would say, and if you go to Bloom 1968, the 5 variables, time, some pupils need more time, but everybody can achieve. So what are those, that one message you said, what are those key messages, Helen, first then, that you think we should be saying to the pupils, we should therefore be saying to the teachers to make sure they're transferring it to the kids as well?
Can I share a slide with you at this point?
I love it.
Because we have this made, and we have this on stickers on the exercise books for our children, and also as posters on the wall, and it's about the culture of our classroom. So is that okay if I screen share? I might have to scroll down to find the slide, so hopefully I can find it.
Do you know what, that's really interesting while you're finding that, talking about the culture. So that's the culture of the department, the culture of the pupils, and everything together. It's so important, really, truly.
Can you see my slide now that says changing the culture of the classroom?
Did you click share screen at the bottom?
Sorry.
This is why you practice these things beforehand, but that's fine.
I did click, share?
There we go, see?
Yeah.
You know what, this is about making mistakes in the classroom, which is fine. I'm sure there it is. We will value our mistakes because we can learn from them. Look, this is fine. This is all good.
And actually, I think that's really important, because I think that some teachers worry about the lower attainers feeling embarrassed or awkward or not feeling that they can contribute. And it's really important to set up an environment in which they don't feel that way. And that's why we talk about a lot to them about it's okay to make a mistake. That doesn't mean you're stupid or you're silly. It's just part of the learning process, and everyone makes mistakes at times. But it's also about having those really open do now discussion points, so that everyone can contribute in some way. Every student can ask a question or make some kind of comment, so they all feel part of that process. So I think that's really important. And what's also really important in our team is we emphasise that we value the progress. So it's about how far you've come along your learning journey. We're not just necessarily celebrating the children that achieved the highest. It's who made the most progress, who came the furthest along that process.
We'll maybe look at how you measure that progress in a short while. Tom, is there anything else that you think with regards to the culture of the classroom that your department used to kind of really be really positive about, or anything that they really felt you had to do?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, there are some things that I'd want to challenge about the kind of notion of ability, and you've mentioned mixed attainment, and I think if you're going to do that, you genuinely want to have mixed attainment groups. So they're actually based on attainment and things like that. But the myths around abilities are worth, if you're the lead in a department or a senior leader in a school and you're advocating this kind of change, it's really worth thinking about the kind of idea that pupils have different abilities, that we can know what they are, that people learn most effectively with people of the same ability or similar ability, and as Helen mentioned, like the people's self-concepts will be damaged if you see someone being really good. And I think there are all sorts of good examples of that, like when you see people go on Strictly or something like that, and you don't put someone who's terrible at dancing with someone that's also terrible at dancing. They get loads better by having the mix there. So I think there's work to be done about kind of challenging the notion of ability and kind of believing that people can improve, as Helen mentioned, because like one of the issues is if you don't, when teachers don't believe that people can improve, they don't create the situations where they can improve. And that's really key, is in terms of thinking about what are your lessons going to look like so that these things can happen?
That's really, isn't it a shame that some staff would start with that, thinking that not everybody can achieve? It's a shame you have to say that, because I think we've all worked with teachers that they don't think, oh, those kids can't do this. And that's a real shame, Helen, isn't it? And it's clearly something that you don't believe.
And so I didn't quite hear what was the last bit you said. Sorry.
Well, I'm just going to stop sharing the screen on that. That you clearly believe that every pupil can achieve as well. It's a shame that some staff see it that way.
Well, and I think the other thing is that when people say that they set by ability, it's like everything Tom said. How do we actually measure that? And the reality is, when most schools go into setting groups, they're setting their students based on some sort of examination or assessment process that they've done in school. And there's so many reasons why that's not a fair process. And some children are going to perform less well in any sort of end of year exam than others, for a whole host of reasons that aren't necessarily about ability. And if we look at coming out of this lockdown that we've had, any teacher that's been involved in the process of doing the online marking, the online setting work, there's a massive discrepancy across what different children are actually managing to do. And a lot of the time that's not lack of will, it's lack of resources, lack of time, lack of a quiet space to study, all of those things. So what would we do? Are we saying that those children come back to school and we then assess them in some way and then set them based on that assessment, when we know that some of them have been massively disadvantaged in that whole process? So, for me, just that's what's wrong with setting, is that you take sometimes the most vulnerable children who have the most disadvantages and are going to succeed, going to struggle to succeed in an exam situation, and then you limit their learning experiences based on that very exam. And it becomes a cycle of, you didn't achieve well when you were this age, so now you're being taught a different diet of maths to everyone else. And then obviously that's going to continue to perpetuate through the system. So, and I just think it would be terrible to do that coming out of these particular circumstances that we're now in.
So I think that even more reason why we praise progress and praise effort, I guess, in the classroom. And effort clearly is one of the 5 Bloom mastery kind of principles as well, that it's down to the time that the pupil's willing to put in as well. So you've got to reward that. So when thinking about leadership, I suppose, as a department, how are you going to reward progress to pupils? Not attainment, not, oh, you got that right, but where have you been to where have you got to? So that's something else for leaders to consider, I suppose. Are there ways that you've both kind of led your departments with that in mind, thinking as to making sure you are rewarding progress, and how have you done that?
Did you want to answer that first, Tom? Or?
Well, I mean, there's the stuff about, like, as you said, about you've got to value effort, and you need to try and instill these kind of effort beliefs into students if they don't already have them, that the idea that you get better through effort, not like you have this kind of natural ability and it's fixed, and that kind of fixed thinking feeds into all of the kind of notions of ability grouping anyway. I think personally, and yeah, I've done a bit of research in this area, my gut feeling is it matters more that the teachers think that people can improve. That's the key thing, that you don't think, oh, they would have been in the bottom set, right? Because one of the things that was really, really always surprising to me was you could get 2 bits of work and go, oh, these would have been in the top set and these would have been in set 8, right? And you can't tell which one is which. And actually, it's a game I like to play with senior leaders in school and go, here's a bit of work from someone that would have been in the top set and someone that would have been in the bottom set. Which one's which? And you can't tell. And I think one of the most interesting things and humbling and exciting things for you as a teacher is just like being prepared to be surprised. Like if you knew what they're kind of were coming in at and their target grades, I would just actually not look at all of those things, because you can be constantly surprised by just how much people can do if you give them a chance. And one of the key things, I think, the only reason that teaching happens, and we do, like, teachers are pretty good, we do a pretty good job of it, and the only reason that happens is because people are more alike than they are different. Like Most kids are more alike than they are different. So most of the things that work, most of the things that you might call good teaching, right, work for everyone. And I would always advocate, and anytime anyone comes to kind of like a mixed attainment conference, I would just be saying, if you do these sorts of things, these sorts of tasks, these sorts of activities, they're good for mixed attainment groups. So they're definitely good for your group, whatever group that is.
Do you know what? I often get that with when you're doing SEND workshops, and in my work with ITT, yeah, if it's good teaching, it's good teaching for everybody. I always find that really interesting. You mentioned that. I think that's a really nice example of something to people to take away. When you've had those moments, to share them with the department that say, hold on, this would have been a pupil set 1, this would have been a set 8, and share those successes with your department and say, look, here is how it's working. It's not going to work straight away for everybody, just like everything else we ever do. It's not an immediate first go. It's going to work. It's going to be over time. But that might be one of those nice ways of sharing successes. What else can department leaders do with regards to scheme of work? So what is it that the scheme of work needs to support teachers, do you think? That goes for whoever wants to jump in first again.
I'll let Helen go.
I don't know if it's not really answering the scheme of work question, but to go back to the progress thing and about how you manage to celebrate progress, okay. I think you have to make it really visible to the students. And that's why we use the learning journeys in the model that I use with my department, because the children can see themselves making progress every lesson. And that's an opportunity for the teacher to be really sort of well done, and what was it that you did today that enabled you to make progress? Or if they haven't, we can talk to them about what could you have done that would have enabled you to make more progress. So for us, every lesson the students are looking back at what they've managed to achieve and where they are compared to where they were previously. So I think it's about making it very visible to them. And I know that's not answering your scheme of work question necessarily.
To a certain degree, because you've planned that journey. So I mean, we could look at one of the learning journeys if you like now, but I think what you've just pointed out is the skills of the pupils realising their own skill, as in metacognition. Yes. And so the role of metacognition clearly stands out quite a bit here. That they see their progress, they reflect on how they could have done it.
That's a massive part of our lesson, is the students reflecting all the time about what it was they did that helped them to achieve. What did they do when they got stuck? What was it that they did that enabled them to move on? And sometimes they haven't, and then it's about having that conversation with them that you haven't really moved on much this lesson. Why? What could you have done differently yourself? Could you have called me over sooner to give you an explanation? Could you have asked for help from someone on your table? But it's constantly about giving them ownership of their own learning as well. That's really important, because I think once children understand how to be a good learner, they're going to become better learners. It's kind of, if you never share that with them, if you never talk to them about those steps and those things that they need to be doing, they're not automatically aware of it. Sometimes you have to make it explicit to them. So
well, I think you have to teach it. You have to teach it. Like, you wouldn't expect them to be able to solve a quadratic equation without teaching them. But so all the stuff that you want to happen, like, I wouldn't expect them to know, what to do when I want them to be quiet without teaching them. I think you should practice all of those. You should teach it. You should practice all of those things. And I suppose one practical thing in terms of that is you can think about, when you're planning your lesson, you can think, how would I help people if they get stuck? What should people do if they get stuck? And then you can gradually think about ways. So you might go, oh, I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to do this. And then you might think, oh, maybe I can tweak some of these things so that the students can begin to learn that you share those in some way. Maybe you put a task up and you have, if you get stuck, do this, then do this, then do this. And then when you go round and someone asks you for help, you go, oh, have you done thing number 1? Or have you done thing number 2? And so you're building in them knowing more of that stuff to do. So it might be kind of like a quite simple thing where they answer a question like, what's the same and what's different about the example that we talked about? So like, if you're teaching a lesson where you do an example and then they do some work, you might have a question that they ask themselves, what's the same and what's different about the example? Eventually you can get a thing where you go, oh, what question might I ask here? And then they either look at you blankly, or you go, or they might go, oh, you might go, oh, what's the same or what's different about this? And it might be that Mr. Francome always says, is that always true, sometimes true, or never true? And eventually I might go, ooh, what question am I going to ask you? And sometimes they don't know, and so I just ask my question. But then eventually they go, you're going to go, is that always true, sometimes true, or never true? I should try some more examples.
You've mentioned there then about almost the common question, what does a mathematician ask themselves? And so, I mean, Helen, you mentioned messages on the front of your book. Are there questions around your room like that? Because I think you said about displays earlier on as well. That's quite powerful to try and trigger that thought process. So, and I think we used to see the 3 Bs. Was it book, brain, buddy, and things like that? Because I imagine, whether I know you're going to pull that face, but the point being that you're trying to at least be more independent first.
We don't have any posters on that, but we do have some, which is what we call the boxing up method, which is how we get them to approach those multi-step questions or the AO3 questions. Mm-hmm. And sometimes where they read the question and it's just too big and it's just too overwhelming, and they're like, I don't know how to get to the final answer. And it's about teaching them that actually, if you try and jump straight to the final answer, you're going to get confused, and it's about breaking the question down into parts. So what do I already know? What information do I have? What maths am I going to be using? What are my calculations going to be? And how can I check my answers correct? So it's kind of teaching them to self-scaffold. So we do a lot of that. So it's not necessarily, I don't have poster displays of things they should be asking themselves. I do have strategies that we use to help them self-scaffold. And we do regularly start a lesson with ask a question or make a comment, which gets them into the habit of conjecturing and questioning and communicating and all of those skills of a mathematician. So, and again, it's about building up their ability to do that, because the first time that you ever put an ask a question, make a comment slide on the board with a class, it's kind of deathly silent, and and you kind of think, oh no, come on. And then the more they get used to doing that, and the more they feel safe to do that, and the more they believe when you say that no question is a silly question, and the more they realise that the class is supportive of each other and they're not going to get laughed at. And then they just really get into that, and they learn that their questions are valid and important, and it's not just me as a teacher asking them questions, it's about them questioning. So it's kind of, I suppose it's habits that you're developing with them as learners, if that makes sense. So I hope that makes sense. It
makes perfect sense. It goes with what Tom was saying, though, with regards to the questions, well, what will Mr. Francome ask us? Because you can't predict that unless he's asked it more than once. So you've got to, and so that first week will be difficult to create that mentality. But I mean, I attended one of the conferences in June 2017, and the first notes on the day are very similar to what you're saying. I just looked back on them this morning. High expectations of all, develop that student's sense of responsibility for each other's learning as well, and talking about success and learning without limits. There's such key messages. And I'm glad I'm glad you both started with this, because if we don't get that right, it's going to be it's going to be much harder in the classroom. You've mentioned a starter there, so ask a question, make a comment. So we'll get to that as well. Lots of little things that you're making me think. I'm making notes here, so excuse me if it looks like I'm looking away. I'm looking at the different things and making lots of notes. We need to go back to scheme of work though. So to prepare our staff. So if you're a leader of a department, you talked about a learning journey. So we should look at that in a moment. But Tom, is there anything that you think your schemes of work were really important that they had to ensure that to support your staff when they're in a mixed attainment classroom?
Well, I could sort of could say yes to that, but I don't know how helpful it is to go, oh, everyone should rewrite their scheme of work so it's like mine, or they should forget everything that they've done before and take away what take Helen's scheme and do that sort of stuff. I think it's probably the best use of people's time is to kind of like evolve what they've got, because I think one of the difficulties about transitioning to mixed attainment or to anything new is, teachers are practiced at doing the things that they normally do. So like if you're in Scandinavia where they teach mixed groups every single day, right, and you threw them into sets, they'd find that problematic. It's exactly the same sort of thing, because they're just used to the other way around. So I would be thinking about, how do we tweak what we've got so it's so I can gradually make it effective for everyone. No, and I think there are loads of advantages. I think a lot of the key advantages of teaching mixed attainment come from things like having a common scheme of work. So, well, I don't know, when I started at my old school, we had 4 different schemes of work for 6 classes. So it basically meant that no one could talk about what they were doing in their lessons. So if you have one scheme of work, right, everyone can talk about it. So everyone can share, like, how do you get into this? What are the common misconceptions? What kind of questions do people ask? What are good answers to them? What's interesting that might come up? You know, how do you prod around for that interesting stuff? How do you support it? How do you challenge it? How do you push people on? What would make a good homework for this? What should you do the lesson before? Like, you can talk about all of those things because it's this shared experience. And I think that was one of the things that was most exciting about it for us, is we had this kind of like shared collegiate experience. And I suppose in terms of the stuff that you're doing in lessons, I don't think there is one way to teach mixed groups, right? There's not just one way of teaching all attainment groups. It's not just you have to do this and that's the only way that can work. And I think the best thing that teachers can do is build on the things that they've already got, the skills that they've currently got, and just like make little tweaks to try and make those a bit better, a bit more effective. So instead of having 3 different tasks for your set 1, your middle sets and your bottom sets, right, I just go, which is the best task, which has the most affordances, which is the most available in it, and why don't we all concentrate on that, making it better? And the way that you do that is, I think, you all work on the maths. You do the maths and you go, what is the experience of doing this maths? What am I taking for granted when I'm doing this maths that they won't necessarily have? What do I build into it? How can I tweak these questions, the order of them, the kind of task, the way that we approach it to make it richer, to get more out of it? I think there are various ways of doing that. But those are the kinds of things I'd be doing rather than throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
I'm glad you said that, because I didn't mean for it to sound like that, but it could have been construed of making a new scheme of work. I'm never an advocate of that, because it's so much work. I think you're right that finding the right resources to extend and doing that together, planning collaboratively and getting together and doing those maths and having those conversations and thinking, who's going to, I imagine, you tell me, what problems are going to occur on this learning journey whilst we do this? Yes, certain pupils might ask this, certain pupils might have this problem, and therefore you're then better prepared for those lessons, I would have thought.
Yeah, pre-mortem, that's what you want. Work out what all the problems might be beforehand, and then think, if this problem was going to come up, it would have been better if we'd done that, and then do that.
And just certainly from this sort of ResourceFULL series, I found it fascinating the insight diagnosticquestions.com gives. Because not only does it tell you the wrong answers, but actually the pupils type their misconceptions and their thoughts of it. So it's a really nice way of, as you put it, the pre-mortem. Helen, can we look at one of these learning journeys then? Is that something you've got ready to share, or I can share on my screen if I've got the right ones, that is?
If you've got one, do you want to share the one that you've picked?
Yeah, fine. Indeed. So I think I downloaded a folder of equations, but I've got those progress maps as well. So something like this.
Oh, perfect. Yeah.
So, to make that whole screen. So this is for year 7, number line. And I noticed how there's the journey, there's the arrow. So can you just talk us through what this means, how it works?
So we give this to students at the start of a unit of work. And with that, there'll be a little set of questions. So I don't know if you've also got that slide, but for each of these statements on the learning journey, there's a question that they can then have a go at.
I'm just scrolling the PowerPoint that I've downloaded from you, so I think they're all the learning journeys, actually.
Oh, right, okay. So with each of those learning journeys, there's a set of questions, and I think you've got an example there.
So there's equations, so same again. You've linked it to the home learning, which is a great idea as well to encourage their efforts, as Heggie Matt always talks about efforts.
Yeah.
But there's
they have a go at the questions, and this is pre-teaching. And this is to find out what they already know. And then we mark the answers to the questions. They do that themselves in class. It's very much about the trust, and there's no point in them cheating at this point, because this is for them to find out what they know now and what they need to learn next. It's not foolproof, because obviously you need to later on check that they can also apply that in different situations and do problem solving and reasoning. But what we didn't want to do was give them a long assessment prior to any teaching, because that seemed unfair. So to keep it brief and to keep it as just a guide, at the start point, we keep the questions quite brief, like the ones you can see, and then they mark their answers and they do a little bit of highlighting. So if you go back to the learning journey,
yep,
they will highlight on the learning journey anything that they got right. So if they got question A right, they will highlight statement A. But we do talk to them about the fact that they need to check that, and then as a teacher, we will check with a little bit of probing questions as well, just check they really do understand. And that is a guide to them about where they might want to start. So for example, if they've highlighted columns A, B, C, and D, then I would not expect them to be choosing tasks that match those skills within the lesson. I'd be wanting them to look at the tasks that go with skill E. Or if it's a multiple entry point task where everyone's got the same prompt in front of them, I'd be wanting them to do something with it that would lead to skill E. Then at the end of each lesson, they will tick and date anything new that they've learned. So at the end of the process, you've got a learning journey that has green highlighting, or whatever colour highlighting, that shows what they knew before any teaching, so prior to you teaching them. And then you've got all this ticked and dated stuff, which shows the progress they've made over time and the new things that they've been learning in the lessons. And then we do an end of unit assessment, and in the end of unit assessment, we specifically assess for problem solving and reasoning. So for each skill, there'll be a fluency question, a problem solving question, and a reasoning question. And so the end of unit assessment is a proper assessment, as opposed to just a short. So yeah, so that's how it works. And then the whole, so at the end of the lesson, they'll tick and date, and they'll also write some sort of reflective comment on their learning during that lesson.
Okay, so the kind of the journaling, which is much more popular in primary than it is in secondary. How do you encourage them to articulate their thoughts?
So we've got loads of different. So in the lessons that I'm sharing at the moment, we've got lots of different examples, and I think if I can just screen share again. So we've got a range of different like sort of self-reflection tools that they might use in a lesson. So let me just check this is working. So hopefully I'm sharing my screen again.
You are indeed.
Yeah. So I think there's some on the end of here, some examples. So sorry. Yeah, so if you want to do something really quickly, I'd get them to shade in on this arrow, and this kind of talks to them about the difference between just being able to answer a question correctly and being confident enough to be able to explain it to someone else. So it kind of those different levels of understanding that they might have. Or we might give them this and ask them to comment on a mistake that they made in the lesson. Lots of sentence starters that you might give them to just write a comment about what it was they did, how they learned, what it was that what strategy they used that helped to make them successful. There's some where we can maybe talk specifically about the growth mindset or the type of mindset that they demonstrated. I really like this one. This is a little bit more detailed, so we'd give them more time for this. So things that they do feel confident to explain, something they're not sure about, something they want to ask me, but you have to build in time if you're using that kind of plenary. Or there's another kind of quick one where we just say, oh, choose something to reflect on. So choose a sentence starter and then write something about how you felt during the lesson. So there's lots of different ways that you can do it, and some of it depends on the type of lesson you've had. Do you just want something quick, or do you want them to be thinking about it in more depth? So we kind of mix them up and use different ones. But we do always have some part of reflection within every lesson.
Tom, did you, you said earlier on that it's like every school that does setting currently, they don't necessarily all teach the same way and have the same scheme of work and the same lesson model. Did you have something similar to this? Go on, sorry.
It's mad, isn't it, that everyone makes it up themselves?
Yeah, well, that's the conversation for another day. But did you do it somewhat similar to this? Yeah, was that similar for you, where the learning journey, where you would have that, this is where we're going, and did that look similar in your school?
No, not particularly, but I don't think there's, that just comes back to what I was saying. I don't think there's just one way of doing it.
Oh.
So I could say a bit more about that, but maybe a more helpful thing would be to say, like, how do you normally teach lessons if there's such a thing as a normal lesson? and then I might be able to say something like what I would do to tweak what you've got, because I think that's the more useful thing than going, as I was saying before, like change everything from scratch.
Well, I'm seeing certainly the EIF looks for small steps, and the NCTM talk about coherence and the 5 big ideas. Initially, my initial approach was, well, here's the small step. I'm going to be challenging mathematical thinking, but everyone will be doing the same small step, was my hope. But I'm worried that's teaching to the middle, which I've read something, I think, on your website, Helen, about that, where it can go wrong. But the idea being that if that's the small step I want everyone to achieve, I'm going to keep challenging people with maybe open middle questions, that kind of thing, where they're really having to think hard for those who've understood that step, and scaffold to those who I'm trying to achieve the basics in that. That's how I'm initially thinking about approaching it. So, I mean, that's where I'm thinking, you mentioned about the planning collaboratively and the what resources to add on. That's what I think I'm going to be doing. Would you, is that something similar then? Would you say, or would that be potentially harmful?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we know is teaching to the middle is not effective. So one of the things that we also know is that tends to happen more if you have sets, because people are more likely to go, right, okay, I've got a group that are the same ability, right, as opposed to a similar ability. Like, one of the things that's nice about having mixed groups is actually it forces you to pay attention to the differences as well as the similarities. So you do have to think about, what am I going to do for someone who's never done this before? And what do I do for the person who's already done it with their tutor? And like, those are some of the biggest differences in how things look like you've taught it really effectively. But it's just something like they've done it before, or they did it with their teacher last year, or they've already done it with their tutor, and it looked like you made it, that you've taught something. So you have to be really aware of that. We know not loads about the most effective. One of the issues, I think, is we don't know loads about what the most effective mixed attainment teaching looks like, right? Because we don't have literature on that, because in the countries where everyone does that, that's not a thing they think about. So they don't write down about that being a different thing, because that's just what everyone does. So if you're in Scandinavia, they do that every day. They don't write anything down about that. But one of the things that we do know is high expectations is really important. So teaching to the top, from my perspective, I would be thinking, what's the thing that's the kind of the top level? And I want that to be the basic thing that everyone gets, right? Everyone is going to get that. And then there's all this richness around that on the top. So you can say, like you mentioned, open middle tasks. I think those kinds of problems are useful, where there's more than one way to get to the solution, and I care about how you're getting there. So instead of asking, even with relatively simple things, like if I was going, instead of going, what is 16 times 25? I might go, how do you work out 16 times 25? Because that's a genuine question, because 16 times 25, I know the answer to. Teachers always ask questions where kids know that their teacher already knows the answer. But you can tweak it to a genuine question and genuinely care. Tom, how do you work that out? Right? And then you can just tweak that a little bit more and go, and how many different ways can you work that out? And then how can you represent the different ways of working that out?
Can I jump in there a second, though? Because maybe I'm using the word teach to the middle in the wrong way then, because my expectation is that everybody achieves the skill in that lesson. And I think looking at the mastery diagram from McCourt's book talks about we're not going to move on until everybody gets that. So that's where the extension with the open middles and some of the questions. If I can share, go on, Helen.
But I would have so many problems with that. Yeah. And I don't know if it's because of the range of the learners that I have in front of me. But then having said that, that's kind of been typical of every school I've been in that has mixed attainment. I think that children have to be allowed, or students have to be allowed, to make progress at the right speed for them. And this idea of rushing everyone to a certain point because you want everyone to have got something by the end of the lesson, I feel uncomfortable with that. And equally, there are going to be some children who maybe are way beyond that point anyway. So I've started units of work and given a learning journey to a year 7, and they've been able to highlight everything. And then I have to totally think outside the box and prepare completely different types of material than what I might initially have thought. So I think this idea that you can get everyone in your class to the same point by the end of the lesson, that would make me feel very uncomfortable. And I think that, yeah, sorry. I don't.
No, absolutely. That's the point of this. I mean, again, maybe I think the word lesson sometimes is a difficult one because it sounds like a unit of time. And if it means the lesson that's something I wanted them to teach, if it takes 3 lessons to get everybody to that point, but then I've got to think of the right extension tasks. I know, Tom, that you're an advocate of a book that I've got to hand, and I think we're both going to refer to it at some stage with regards, if I make this change, then what happens? And so you can still be challenging everybody with the same, let's say, key learning point, because looking at your model, Helen, there was equations going on, but they could be doing different types of equations. One with 1 variable, one with 2-step, one with variables on both sides. Whereas I suppose the model I initially had been considering approaching was, well, I want everybody adding unit fractions, but I am going to have to come up with challenging ways of stretching those whilst I'm getting the others to the 80. Again, that's using the 80% model, if you like, from I've seen in McCourt's book.
I think I'm just saying that the focus shouldn't be that. Where I want everyone to be at the end of the lesson is understanding more than they did at the start of the lesson. But what that looks like for the different children in my class is different. And if I try and have some goal, whether it be at the end of the lesson or at the end of 2 lessons, at the end of 3 lessons, where everyone is at the same point, then I think that's a misunderstanding of what a mixed attainment class is. Okay. So the goal is everyone making progress and everyone understanding more than they did before, but not everyone being the point where they're the same.
So, Tom, you said about adding to your scheme of work. If they do have that kind of scheme of work where here's key learning point 1, here's key learning point 2, and the white rose and kangaroo style of breaking down in their scheme of work, and they've done that, how can we add to that then? Because would it be then the key learning point for pupil 1, those are the steps that they're going to do, and we'll let the pupils, as you suggest, Helen, go through those key steps, and they'll be at different places on those key learning point steps. Would that be a good way of using the current scheme to work, maybe if they had something like white rose or kangaroo where it does have those key learning points?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know loads about what those schemes of work are like, but what I would be thinking about, I mean, the example you gave of adding 2 fractions, so that's just like a procedure or a process or whatever. And what I mean, I don't think maths teachers only teach procedures and processes. What they also need to do is all the other stuff in the national curriculum, like reasoning and problem solving and that sort of stuff. So I would think of it of, well, I kind of think my role is about developing people as mathematicians, and their role is about becoming mathematicians. So things like asking questions, making conjectures, being organised and systematic, explaining, convincing, all of that kind of stuff, specialising, generalising, however, or any of the different terms that you use for that. So I think in whatever you're doing, if you don't have those things, it's not a maths lesson. It's just some stuff, right? So you have to have a way to find in whatever you're doing. But I'm quite happy to teach, adding fractions. I certainly teach that, right? But I think if you've got an exercise, like a common kind of format of a lesson on, say, adding fractions might be the teacher does some examples, right? However you do it, and then the kids do some practice. So I'm really, really interested in like the kinds of practice that people do and what that looks like. And I personally think there are ways to practice that stuff where it's not just about, I just go through the exercise and I get some ticks or I get some crosses and then I decide if I got 8 out of 10, then that's enough, or whatever it was that you said. So what I would be looking for is, if I'm going to do a lesson like that, having a task that's worth talking about. So there's something in that task that we can have a conversation about. So if you have people who are already good at this stuff, or they did it last year or whatever, that there's something in it for them to notice, to be able to make some generalizations about it, like maybe try out some other examples, that kind of thing. But it's still providing that kind of like specific practice of the particular thing that you're working on.
Is
right?
it?
It's not the only thing you should do. Sometimes you should do stuff where it's not obvious what you're doing, and there should be different approaches, and you should value all those different approaches. But sometimes I do want to practice the stuff on the curriculum. We've got a curriculum. You know, we could argue about what's in there and whether it should be in there, and it is a kind of conversation that maths teachers should contribute to. But I'm quite happy to just accept that it is what it is, and I'll just go, I'll teach that stuff, right? But I want interesting and varied opportunities to do so.
Helen, that sounds like what you say about the ask a question, make a comment.
I think so, but I kind of want to reiterate something that I think Tom was saying. The problem solving and the reasoning and the skills of the mathematician, they're what we should be teaching in our lesson. And I get concerned when I hear about like this. I've seen things on Twitter where people are implying that you would have some mathematical content, and that the way that you challenge your higher attainers is that they would be problem solving and reasoning. And I think every child in your classroom, regardless of their prior attainment, should be problem solving and reasoning. But some students in my class will be problem solving and reasoning with an easier skill, if you like. So they might be adding or subtracting different fractions with common denominators, but doing something. But I'd still want them to be involved in a task that gets them to problem solve and reason as well. It's not, I don't see problem solving and reasoning as something that only our highest attainers should ever have access to. That's what every child in your classroom should be doing.
Well, it's an entitlement of the curriculum, isn't it? That is, if you're not doing that, you're not teaching the curriculum. Right?
And I think some of the mastery models that I've seen, and I don't know a massive amount about mastery, so I don't want to like come across as I'm slating mastery, but some of the ways that I've seen it described is that you're kind of, the challenge is the problem solving and the reasoning, and that concerns me if it means that some children are never getting to the point where they problem solve and reason, that some children are just doing lots and lots of fluency type questions. So, yeah.
No one agrees what mastery is, Helen. That's kind of why I do inverted commas. I'm a teaching from mastery specialist, and I'm not going to go down that route. It's frustrating. Although read the NAMA document, that's a good one for looking at that. Helen, I want to go back. I think this might be linking to what Tom said, but also when the I think Maths No Problem, they start with an anchor task. So there's conversation, there's reasoning straight away. I think that's similar to your ask a question, make a comment. So have you got any examples like that? Because you're absolutely right. I think if I wasn't really thinking about it, I think I would have gone down the route of my extension being reasoning problem solving. But Tom, you're absolutely right. That's the curriculum. Everyone's entitled to it.
So, I mean, just because it's 1, 2, 3 doesn't mean that's the order. It has to be written down in an order.
It's so worth pointing out. Helen, can we see? Have you got examples to that hand?
Yeah, and I think this is the kind of thing as well that where Tom was saying that you can tweak something. So let me just. Sorry, I'm not sure if I've shared correctly again. Sorry.
Well, I've got some tweaking things I want to share in a sec as well. So one I've learned from Tom, but also other questions I've seen. So I'll share some of those questions in a bit. But while you're trying to
can you actually see my PowerPoint, Tom, or have I done that wrong?
I'm afraid.
Not okay.
No, I know in a bit I'll show questions from Watson and Mason with the what do mathematicians think and what if I change this, and that's certainly what I saw from an example from this book, which again I'm going to do a very crude screenshot of it and share that in a bit as well, while Helen's trying to find her screen.
Yeah, I can say a bit about that.
I can't screen share anymore. Sorry, I'm very confused about what's happened.
Tom,
do you want me to say a bit about adapting and extending?
Please do, Tom.
Right. I will also have to work out.
Awesome.
Okay, so the book that you were talking about is this. I think for me, there's two really key things out of that. Actually, can you see it?
Yes, indeed we can.
So I was going to say there's loads more in this book, but I'm going to talk mainly about this kind of technique for adapting and extending the questions that you've already got. Because I suppose I think the secret, is not to throw everything out. It's to make gradual changes and just make the stuff that you've got better. And there are relatively straightforward ways to do this. I don't know if you're familiar with this book.
No,
which
totally.
is The Art of Problem Posing. Brown and Walter have this technique, which kind of Prestige and Perks riff on in Adapting and Extending, which is about just taking a familiar problem and asking, what if not? What if not that, but something else? So I was going to give an example of a task. Find the mean, median, and mode of those numbers. That's like a typical type of problem. And if you wanted, you could pause the video and do that. But what you get is the mode is 3, the median is 3, and the mean is 4. An alternative task is to go, if I give you those, come up with 5 positive integers where the mode is 3, the median is 3, and the mean is 4. Right. That's a more challenging task. And then if I say, can you find all of the sets of 5 positive integers which have a mode of 3 and a median of 3 and a mean of 4? That's a really nice task, right? There's loads of work that you can do about that, a bit of a build-up of give me 5 where the mode's 3 and another and another and another, and these different types of questions, and I want this thing and that thing, so I add some additional constraints. And it doesn't have to be 3, 3, and 4. What if it's 4, 3, and 4, or 4, 4, and 4? Or what if they're all the same? What if I include the range and they're the same? Like, you can get loads of interesting stuff out of that, but you still get loads of practice of finding the average. Finding the different averages. And actually this other task, it's not to say that you should do this task and not that. I can think of plenty of good reasons why I might want to do this sort of task where it's kind of, there is an answer. Like if you're teaching, you might want to do some examples, you might want some kind of guided practice where people do their own, and you check whether they've understood what they're supposed to be doing. You can assess whether you're going to need to intervene with this group and go and have a chat to those people or that. But you just do it in a way where it's leading to somewhere more than I don't just do questions like this. And I think there's a kind of helpful, Colin Foster's got this really lovely model of the convergent divergent model, if you've heard of it. But you kind of have, you want a question where everyone gets the same answer at the start, and then a question where everyone goes off in different and gets different things, right? So you converge first of all, because it's really helpful for kind of like assessing and stuff like that. So what I was going to say about it is the way that you do that is you just take any familiar problem, any textbook question, anything that you would normally do, list all the givens, so everything there is about that, and then take one of them and just ask, what if not that thing, but something else, right? So I can chuck you an example if you want.
Please do.
So here's an example with a typical kind of trig question. So you try and list all the givens. So that's everything in the problem. It's right angled, the hypotenuse is 4, one of the angles is 40 degrees, one of the angles is 50 degrees. You have to find the opposite. You have to find one side. And you could go on like that and list different things about that. And then you just pick any one of those things and go, what if not that, but something else? So what if not the angle is 40, but 50, 60, 70? But if I keep everything else the same, that might be a more interesting task, or it might not be, which it comes back to that point that I was saying earlier. I think one of the best things that departments can be doing is working on some maths together. Because if you do this sort of stuff, you have to work out whether it's whether it makes for an interesting task, or it's just a messy mess that just goes off in all other different directions. So some examples: what if not find the opposite side, but find all the missing information? So that's a much better task because it's kind of goal-free. You can approach it in lots of different ways. I can value the different methods, that kind of thing. And then, yeah, I said you have to try out the different tasks. But so an adaptation of that I've made, which I quite like, is find all the right angles where where two of these three things are true. So it has a side of 4 centimeters, has an angle of 40 degrees, and has a side of 5 centimeters. Now, then what you end up with is the practice might be quite similar to the kind of practice you'd get in an exercise for some people. But for the people for who that practice is kind of straightforward, there's interesting stuff about how do you know you've got all the possibilities? Can you justify that you've got all the possibilities? The same with the averages thing. Like I could tell you, I mean, and maybe I will spoil it. There are 11 sets with that average question, which I think is a nice combination. I use that one a lot because it's not too many. It's not too many that you can't find them all. Like everyone can find them all, but it's enough that there's some challenge in finding them all. You have to be quite strategic in how you go about it, right? But I would never tell that to a class because I want you to justify that you've got them all, like because that is a way of moving on. If you can move on beyond the just finding the average or just working out the missing sides. So I mean, I could give another example, or you could even do this if you want. So here's a typical question: complete the sequence. So I'll start you off with a given. Do you want to play? Okay. You have to put the next 2 terms in.
And then you've got to help. Okay, so I mean, the solutions are, okay, 29, 34. But then it's all the givens. So the given is that it's going up currently, it's increasing by 5.
Perfect, yeah.
It's given only that we only had to have 2 solutions at the moment. It happened to be the last 2.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think what else we're given. Are we given much else?
Well, I mean, you could say the first term is 4.
Oh, we're given
the second term's 9.
Okay.
Right, and this is important, right? Because some things that might seem obvious, I think obvious is like the most dangerous word in maths, because things that seem obvious to me are not necessarily obvious to anyone else. That's all. And it's really important that you have this kind of thing where if you're doing this, you have to list the things that are obvious. So I could give you some examples of some givens. So the first 5 are given. We need to find 2 more. We need to find the 6th and the 7th. The first number's 4, the second's 9. The first 2 numbers are square numbers. The fourth numbers are prime. The pattern in the units goes 4, 9, 4, 9.
This feels quite goal-free. But when you mentioned goal-free a moment ago, it could have been, well, what can you tell me about this sequence? And instead of having the words complete the sequence, suddenly you'd be able to find all of these, wouldn't you? And that also allows for kind of sharing of what do the people already know.
Well, one of the things about this is I think it's about that practice thing again. The first time you try and do this sort of stuff, it feels quite hard. Like you can't think of that many things. But once you've done a few, it gets easier and easier. And like eventually you can get kids to do this as well. So each number is a multiple of 5, take away 1. You might know the nth term and things like that. Some people might find the nth term. But kids can do this as well. You can get them to do this as a task. And then you could go, okay, pick one and change it and work on it in your class if you wanted to do that. If you've never done this sort of stuff before, I wouldn't do that. I would pick one as a teacher. I would do this in the private of my room or office or whatever, staff room, department meeting, and go, which is the one that we're going to pick to work on, which affords the sorts of things that we want. And then as a department, play on it. So I've got a few examples of things that you could change about this one. Yeah, so for example, what if not the first 5 numbers are given, but the first 2? So there's lots of different ways of continuing this sequence now. So I have to think, so the focus might be more then on explaining and justifying why you've continued it the way that you have. So there's the focus, the mathematical focus of that changes. Like it doesn't have to be, I mean, we're assuming this is a linear sequence. I mean, there's an infinite way of, I guess, of putting those 2 in there. Yeah, so there's more kind of recording, justifying, that kind of thing. But what if it's not a multiple of 5, take 1, but take 2 or take 3 or take 4 or take 5? So I might work on kind of sequences that have something in common. So there's something to talk about here. And I think you could find good examples of this type of thing kicking around in like old textbooks. If you go to like Craig's variation website, there's good examples of that kind of thing that you could then go, oh, right, I can see what's going on here. I might use this as something to talk about, but you also learn by looking at those things about how to make those things yourself, how to tweak the things you've got to make them more like that, to make them so. And the kind of rule of thumb for me is if there's something worth talking about at the end of it. What if we only give one term and it's the third term? So can you find, now there's a lot of possibilities there. So I might restrict it to 5 sequences. And what if I want to, I don't know, like the averages thing, rather than just 5 sequences, how would you describe all the sequences that are linear that have 14 as the third term? Now then I think you've got some interesting maths to do, because it's relatively, well, it's certainly worthwhile, but a relatively more straightforward thing to do to write down a linear sequence that will have 14 as the third term, and another, and another. But if you're kind of organized and systematic about how you go about doing that, then there's some really interesting maths that comes out about being able to describe all the sequences that have 14 as the third term. And like, if you want to extend that further, you might go, what if I look for some quadratic sequences? What if I have 14 as the third term and 30 as the fifth term?
Let's stop there for a second, because one thing I think people who are going into this will be considering is, well, hold on a second. I was teaching linear sequences a moment ago. Hold on, am I supposed to be teaching quadratic? And so the fear of teaching from the front to everybody, it's going to have to be, I think you referred to it as well, both of you, going to small groups, and might this group come over and work with me on this in this area, because some will be going on to quadratic while some are still not really got the concept of linear perhaps.
No, I don't think so. I mean, you can just take this off. I think if you're teaching a lesson on linear sequences and that's the thing that you want to work on, if I want to work on linear sequences, I don't pick the ones that are I don't do the tasks that are
oh, sorry.
I mean, yeah, I think, and it's really about all the time about being really clear about what your purposes are as a teacher. I think everything about teaching is being really clear yourself about what your purposes are. And yeah, so if you just want to do linear sequences, you definitely don't do higgledy-piggledy all over the place. If you want people to know that there are sequences that aren't linear, you don't only do linear sequences. So it's like, depends on your purpose. But yeah, I mean, everyone should have a go at this task. It's a lovely task. And of course, it doesn't have to be 14 as the third term. It can be 7 as the fifth term, or whatever you want. And it's easy to make little adaptations then.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I thought that book really opened my eyes as to how easily you can extend question without having to create lots of resources. And I think that's what you've done there. Is it's not. I think one of the biggest fears for teachers going into this for the first time will be creating 1,000 resources. I don't think that's the case. I'm hoping Helen's not disappearing, because I know she wanted to say something. So I can see her moving away.
Sorry, I just realised I'm running out of battery. Sorry. I'm not working out.
You're right though. You don't necessarily need more resources. You just want the same resources. Yeah. Right, but used more effectively. Right. So you can develop it so you get more questions, and that's the thing about the main advantage of teaching. The thing that's going to be really exciting for people going into mixed groups is they can work together about going, how do we wring more out of this? And I think one of the best things I ever learned about teaching was I was always going, oh, I taught this to set 2 last year, and now I'm teaching set 3. I need to come up with a different task. And one of the best things I learned was to stick with the same tasks and just every year make them better and better. So I get more out of the pupils and they get more out of the maths by me just kind of like refining it, and alongside the colleagues, the team of people that are working together on this with this shared goal of trying to just create all these lovely, wonderful mathematicians.
and by doing that, of course, you're having the same standards for absolutely everybody. Helen, you wanted to say something during that?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I really love all of Tom's tasks, and we use quite a lot of them in our lessons. But I slightly disagree with one thing that he was saying, because I have no issue with having the focus of the lessons being on linear sequences, but there might be 2 or 3 students in my classroom that are doing quadratic sequences, and I'm okay with that, and I'm okay with going over to them and giving them a different explanation at a different time in the lesson, because I think that there might be some students in the class thought they just are ready for that, and they need to move on. So I wouldn't want to hold them back because I've decided that the purpose of the lesson is linear sequences. Like, maybe that is the purpose of the lesson for most of my students, but in a mixed attainment class, you have to recognise that sometimes there might be students who, for that, isn't appropriate, and they're doing something slightly different. That's kind of my view on it. I'm not saying that I would automatically move my higher attainers onto something different, but if, having spoken to them and discussed with them and talking about their learning as they're going along, if it feels like it's the right time for them to move on to move away from linear sequences, then I would do that. Yeah.
But as you said, Helen, as well, you make sure that everybody's done their reasoning and the problem solving.
Yeah.
Not linear. But I think then that goes back to the one problem that I think I'm worried about is stood at the whiteboard. Do you know what? I'm working with these guys right now, and now I'm working with these guys, and I'm working with this group. And I think there's letting them go, being that little bit braver. I imagine in your classroom, especially, Helen, by reading what you've done, you're around the room a lot. It's busy. There's probably less teacher time altogether. I'm not sure if I'm right in saying that, though.
I don't know anymore, because it's been such a long time since I taught differently from how I teach now. But I think, earlier on when we were talking about tweaking things, and Tom was saying not to change massively what people are doing as teachers, and I'm not disagreeing with that, but I do think that if you have a mixed attainment class, you do have to spend a certain amount of time teaching your learners how to learn. And that means that sometimes they are independent of you as the teacher, and sometimes they are learning at a different speed, and sometimes they're having to find something out for themselves, or move on when everyone else hasn't, or continue to work on something when everyone else has moved on. And it's kind of, I think that's an important part of it. So I think that to go back to right where we started at the beginning of this kind of meeting, I think if you're starting mixed attainment, don't overlook the role of the child in that process, is I suppose what I'm saying. So, but yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, that's it. That's all I think.
I'm excited. I mean, I can tell you what, I don't know how long, I haven't started, I didn't check how long we've been recording this, but I'm more excited by it now. But and one thing I thought that was really important by having both of you on was to say, look, there isn't just one way, and which is the way that you are going to be the most comfortable with. What is it? How, everyone's going to make their, as a department, talk about it and share the methods.
Yeah.
If I can share the successes, but what's going to work for us as a department.
I think that's really important, actually. And one of the things, I'm sure Tom will agree, that comes out of the Mixed Attainment Maths conferences is all of the different approaches that we see. And I go to see other teachers' workshops, and I'm really excited by what they're doing, and it's different from what I'm doing. And then I'll take elements of what they're doing and use it differently in my classroom. So it is about finding what suits it's about what your team is comfortable with, and what's going to work for them and going to work for your learners. Yeah.
Tom, I think some of the tasks you're referring to are either called low threshold, high ceiling, or low floor, high ceiling. The accessible one, the trigonometry task, I think, was a good example of that as to how far I could extend it. I know Enrich have a certain range of those. What resources, where do you find some of those yourself? Yes, there's going to be departments, we all advocate the departments working together, but let's be honest, we want people to be having as many resources as possible. So they've got that comfort blanket. Still do it, but we can't say there aren't resources, because that wouldn't be fair. So what would you kind of promote to tell people to go towards now?
Yeah, I really like Enrich. Loads of their tasks are really good tasks, so they're really good for everyone. So yeah, I agree with that. Obviously, I think Don Stewart is brilliant for those kind of activities that are worth talking about. All of Don's stuff is great for that kind of thing. The mathematical etudes is another place where I would go and get, again, really good kind of practice tasks. So if you are working on a bit of maths and you want everyone to practice it, like Colin stuff's really good for that. Yeah, I mean, I think it's always hard to do this kind of thing because it's the things that I want to say are the things that I sort of think that everyone knows about, but people don't necessarily know about those. I think like you can get a lot of value in like some of Craig's websites. They're useful as well. Craig Barton's.
Well, the maths ones are really good for mathematical thinking, aren't they? And there's the performing the fluency, but then actually discussing what's the same, what's different, and that's developing a mathematician. I must point out that in September, don't know when people are watching this, but we've got a Don Newton special on ResourceFULL. We've got an Enriched special as well, so I'm glad you said both of those. But I think variation theory, the link between all the questions is often missed out. People just think it's a set of questions, but it's not. There's the relationships between them. And Helen, you've been talking a lot about the what do you persuade your pupil? How do you coach your pupils? Well, actually, I would want to coach.
Well, can I just chuck one in before?
Go on.
The other one I would say is if you want more, if you go to Andrew Blair's website, the inquiry maths thing, I would really recommend that people look at that because there's loads and loads of really helpful. I mean, there's brilliant tasks, so that's fine, right? But there's also loads and loads of really helpful detail about how to work on the tasks. So if you are trying to do something, so, you know, sometimes I would teach the whole class and then, but I think sometimes you should have some time where it's much more open and like pupils work on their own questions and that sort of thing. And actually the balance of that, how you strike that balance is an important decision, personal decision for you as a teacher and for the department to be thinking about and talking about and arguing about probably as well. But there's really, really good stuff like guidance. I think that's really helpful if you're kind of new to that way of working and you want to like dip your toe in. But also if you're always working like that, there's also like really brilliant tasks. There's just loads of really brilliant tasks on there.
I've been meaning to ask Kim to do this with me as well, but Helen, I know you've because I downloaded that equations one, and I know it was lessons 6 to 8. I know you had the inquiry math, so I know you used.
We have an inquiry task, an inquiry lesson from Andrew's website, Inquiry Maths, in every single unit of work for every single year group. Like our whole scheme of work hinges on that. So yeah, so I think that's really important. I'm really glad that Tom mentioned it because yeah, I can't stress enough how inquiry is really embedded into the way that we teach.
And here is the start of. I'm just going to your equations in year 7s, and there it is. Ask a question, make a comment. So is this is an inquiry maths activity? Yeah.
But I think that if you are going to be looking at inquiry maths tasks, you really do have to go to the inquiry maths website to understand. I mean, I've taken that because we've done training on inquiry maths with the department. So I've taken that and put it into a PowerPoint that I know my department can use and understand the process. But I do think that you would have to, so for example, on the Inquiry Maths website, when you go to the equations inquiry, there's lots of examples of where that inquiry might lead in a lesson and how different classes have responded to it. So I think you need to go directly to the site for that.
Absolutely. I saw these though, which I thought were nice, just to kind of create those prompts as well, which is on the next slide is really useful. I think we've just lost Helen. She'll come back in a second. But no, I thought these were really nice because these are the scaffold. These are scaffolds as well, just to start those conversations. And I'm hoping people will be realizing that, I said this before, it won't work straight away. It will hopefully work with time. It will work with time, I'm sure, if people are willing to keep going with it. But are these what inquiry maths? Tom, have you used it very often? I do want to meet Mr. Blair, so I'd like Dr. Blair. I'd like to draw a hand.
Yeah, I mean, I would look at the tasks. There are loads and loads of great tasks out there. We don't need, people don't need to reinvent the wheel, right? There are loads of good things out there. It's worth knowing how to adapt things, right? But it doesn't mean that you have to do that all the time. Like, it's useful because you can do it in the moment. Adapting and extending, I've always found really powerful because if something comes up and I don't have an extension, I know I can always get one. right? And I don't need it. I don't necessarily need like loads of resources for it, as you were saying. And you know, I don't know if that's true, if it's the same situation in every school, but lots of schools that I've talked to, they're in kind of a situation where money is tighter. Certainly that's true at my university. Like money's got certainly a lot tighter and everything. So all the things where you don't have to go in and buy new resources or spend loads of time photocopying, it's kind of really useful to have that kind of thing.
I'm going to share this as well, because you just said something really important. It's not about, Helen's trying to get back in, so we'll let her back in. Having those extension questions up your sleeve, so you don't have to have all those resources. You're back, Helen, we've got you.
I'm so sorry.
Please
I'm so
worry.
sorry.
No, please don't worry. We're looking at these questions, having these kind of the up your sleeve kind of questions. And so these questions from Watson and Mason, and being able to just have those ready, because the fear, I think, for many is loads of resources, but Tom's demonstrated there as to how to adapt, how to extend, and look at the skills. You mentioned the habits of mind earlier, Helen, as well, and I suppose these would be really useful for staff as well.
Mm-hmm.
I hope, anyway. I'm looking forward to the challenge. It is going to be a challenge, but it'll be challenging for me. Can I, because we've gone well over what the time you both agreed to do, so good on you for being part of this. Let's go toward the end and then say, what are those pieces of advice that maybe we haven't had a chance to cover in the last hour and 10 minutes or so? What is it that you think you want to pass on to people that say, look, you're taking this on, what do you want to do? Ladies first.
I think I don't know if I've got anything to add to what I said already, but I think is to really kind of embrace all the positives of mixed attainment teaching, and to also, okay, there's a lot where you can just adapt and tweak, but also just to kind of think, if we really want this to be successful, what is the one big change that we're going to have to make? And for me, that big change would be about giving some sort of ownership to the pupils in the learning process. So, and I actually do think that that is an important part of mixed attainment maths teaching, and that if you can find a way to do that, and I don't think that needs a dramatic change, it just means that be aware of it and articulate it and make it explicit to children that they have a role to play in their learning. And probably most people do that anyway, but it's just making that even more explicit in terms of a mixed attainment environment.
And when we talked about resources, Don's website, Don Newton's website, and Rich A2 to be mentioned, Inquiry Maths, of course, mixedattainmentmaths.com. It's got to be mentioned as well, because you're, as we mentioned earlier, uploading loads of stuff there, and the theory behind it, and the links to your conversation with Craig Barth. And if people want to hear more from that, Tom, I know you've spoken with Craig as well, and both shared your further thoughts. So hopefully that will have been useful. Thank you very much, Helen. Tom, anything from you particularly think we haven't brought in that would be that maybe a key message?
Well, I suppose there are four things that I think are really important about that we know from the kind of literature on mixed attainment teaching, is that you've got to have these notions of these like kind of flexible conceptions of intelligence. Like teachers have to believe in that people can improve, believe in improvement to be able to create it. There's the high expectations, we talked about that, like not teaching to the middle, teaching to the top, that sort of thing. We haven't really talked much about the idea of kind of flexible within class grouping, because one of the problems of setting that Helen mentioned is like you do this single test and you get grouped into your group. But if you and me both get 50 out of 100 on a test, we probably didn't get the same 50 things right, right? So it is sensible to do kind of like assessment, all the things that you would normally do, assessment for learning, and go, oh, actually, this group need more on this. So it does make sense to group people together on a kind of temporary basis based on the need that you're addressing, right, within a class, right? So you might go, oh, right, I did an exit ticket at the end of last lesson, so I'm going to move. These people would make sense if they work together, right? So when you kind of mentioned like sort of, I might go to this person and this person and this person. It's much easier if you're doing that with like 3 or 4 groups of children. And occasionally I'm going to talk to the people who are miles ahead, and occasionally I'm going to talk to people who need a bit more teacher time for support and that sort of thing.
Helen, did you want to jump in on something there?
Well, no, I think that definitely if you're being flexible, so there'll be a time in a lesson where I might say, oh, do you two want to sit together because you're working on the same task? And that will happen within a lesson. I would very definitely steer away from trying to ability group your classroom. You don't want to have a table of low attainers and a table of high attainers. I don't think that's
I
what's
don't
on
think Tom
there
was
at all. Just, yeah, but just to kind of, in case anyone is to misinterpret that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we should maybe say a couple of things about that, because one of the things that I thought was worth mentioning that we didn't was about if you're the head of department and you're picking up these new year sevens, like how do you allocate people to groups? So I guess there'll be some people who don't have any option about that, like maybe they're deciding they're going to teach in form groups or tutor groups for social distancing purposes, and then there's nothing you can do about that. And then how do you group them in your room? So, you know, I've taught mixed attainment for a long time. I've tried every possible thing. Like, do you go, oh, I'm going to have a group. I'm going to have 4 people that are sat near each other, where I've got sort of 2 in the middle and 1 that's a lower prior attainment and 1 higher, so they can all work together, but the gap's not too big. Like all of that stuff, my best recommendation would just be to randomize it. So if you have to do it with your groups across the year, you just go in Excel, get everyone, put a random number next to everyone, and just work and just sort them and organize them randomly. And the benefit of that is they get randomized on all the things that you can know about, like their prior attainment, but also on the things that you don't know about, like their dispositions and their socioeconomic status and their background. And if you get some, I mean, I don't necessarily say or do it completely randomly, like, because you can do the same thing with your seating plan in your class very quick. But if you did it and you went, this is a terrible combination, you can just redo it, right? So you can just randomize it again, so it's more random. But yeah, I definitely wouldn't have like, you know, the moped table and the Ferrari table.
But it happens. We know it happens in some schools. So, yeah.
Do you know what seating plans was on the list of questions, wasn't it? And I think we've referred to a little bit there. So I think the message, am I right in saying that be ready to be flexible? Certain pupils will be different in certain lessons. And as you mentioned, if we both got 50 out of 50, I'd be amazed I got the same as you. But also, you're right, it wouldn't be the same 50. And so be prepared to be flexible, prepared to ask people to move. I'm hoping that's okay with social distancing, with the bubbles. I'm hoping we'll be allowed to do that in the classroom, but that is a concern. I have a feeling that was the third of 4 things, Tom. You said there was 4 things. Was it? Felt like the third. Maybe I'm wrong.
Oh, Tom, I feel like number 4 is very important.
Oh, is it? I can't remember what it's going to be. Sorry.
Well, do you know what?
Didn't I do 4?
Okay, well, in which case...
Yeah, I mean, one, I'll just chuck a 4th in. I don't think this was the one. I kind of think of mixed attainment as like a Trojan horse. Like it's a way of getting teachers to talk about their practice more, right? And that's what kind of, like, because we had loads of success with mixed attainment teaching, but kind of like, if you look at the literature on it, it doesn't really make that much difference in terms of attainment, like whether you group people or not. And the kind of, you don't significantly increase or reduce the attainment range in sets. Like you get outliers, sure, but you get those anyway. So it doesn't make that much difference overall to attainment. And that's partly because we don't know enough about it, right? But I think one of the things that makes it really useful is it gets teachers out of their silos and talking to one another and making use of each other as a team. So that's where I think it's a really like a catalyst for improvement, to get teachers talking more to each other about their practice.
And there's plenty of research about collaborative CPD and the benefits from it. So do you know what? You both got, I mean, there's key messages I'm trying to think from both of you, and where, Tom, you said same resources, but used more effectively. Helen, you've talked a lot about the culture and the we've got to set those standards, and we've got to be the standard as well. And I think some really, really powerful messages today. But thank you both so much for giving up your time as well. It's been really, really, really interesting. Honestly, it has. So thank you both again.